Tonight, on the CBS Late Movie, chilling suspense as apes reveal the truth about the fate of mankind.
ご経営いかがですか？渡辺Danです。Today I'm going to talk a little bit about what's really going on at Disney. Now I know everyone's been talking a lot about Disney over the past several months or years, but there's an area of the whole Disney saga that's not really being given enough emphasis, and that is the important part that China has played in a lot of what has happened with the Walt Disney Company, if not all of entertainment in general. And that is that China, for a very, very long time, was combined with the newly emerging world of streaming that gave the entertainment industry a heady sense of irrational exuberance. And what does that mean? That means that they felt that no matter what they were going to do, that they couldn't possibly lose money. And worse, that caused them to not even think when it came time for companies like BlackRock to start pushing that they increase their amount of ESG content. Why would they? Why would they care? Because the promise of eternal streaming as well as China meant a lot. Now, what do I mean by eternal streaming? Let's start there. The promise of eternal streaming was that Netflix was growing by leaps and bounds. And Netflix was a lot cheaper than conventional cable. So many of the, shall we say, hedge funds, geniuses, and all of the other typical Wall Street Ivy League types were looking at that saying, wow, that was an immense savings. Look at how much money they made. And with that in mind, the other studios jumped on board and felt that they too would be able to have that same amount of incredible largesse. In fact, at one point, it was posited that every single one of the streaming services would be able to net approximately 400 million subscribers apiece. Now, when we think of that with today's mindset, that's patently ridiculous. But at the time, it seemed plausible because the estimation was even then it would be a lot cheaper than the average cable package was at the time. So many people would not hesitate to take on that kind of financial commitment. Now, I understand that because we have to look at who a lot of these people were. These are rich kids. These are kids who came from a life of privilege and for whom $1,000 is walk around money. It's less than walk around money, in fact. And so just like the vice president of Budweiser, the vice who came up with the Dylan Mulvaney thing, what was she living? She was living in an $8 million condo. That was not from her job. So anyway, you have people with that kind of money not realizing that for a lot of people who were faced with $100 to $200 to maybe even $300 cable bills, that once that money was siphoned off to another area, once they said they were going to cut the cord, that money found a new home, and they weren't about to invest in it again into that realm. So that was a fallacy on the part of every single one of the streaming services that were based on the studios. And trust me, Disney was probably one of the most enthusiastic of them because they knew they had a captive market. They knew that no matter what, they had kids, and that television had become the ipso facto babysitter. And even if the parents might have a little bit of trouble, perhaps grandparents would have it, or someone in the family would have the Disney service. So there was an enthusiasm that looked like there was no way to lose. Now, a big part of that growth, a big part of that 400 million subscribers was based partially on the notion of China. But China was a two-pronged threat. The first of those two prongs was theatrical, was conventional theatrical, because during the time when streaming was booming, so was China's economy. In fact, China's economy was looking so robust that it was common for people to assume that it would take over as the world's #1 economy sooner rather than later. something that clearly now isn't going to happen because of what's been happening with all of their real estate development in the homeland, as well as such a large percentage of the population having the majority of its wealth in real estate. That's domestic real estate. And now that that market is in the process of collapsing, as it is worldwide, that hegemony isn't going to happen. But that's aside. So while that was growing, China's middle class had grown to approximately 600 million people. And that was the number that the studios were looking at. That's the middle class. That's not the working class. That's not the average Chinese. That's the people who had spare money. And what they felt was that the hunger for movies and filmed entertainment was so strong that the current deals that they had existing with China, where China was basically kicking back about 25 cents on the dollar based on their revenues, which are revenues that are not verifiable. It's air money, in other words, relative to what might actually be made. But that they would eventually be able to negotiate deals that were very similar to what was going on in Europe, which was much more on a 45-cent per dollar of money taken in at the gate. So with that in mind, with the fact, and this is the key part, if they were going to get the same amount of return that all foreign markets in general were kicking back home, then it went to figure that China was the equivalent of North America plus half of Europe. In other words, China would become the #1 market. It would not be one that was based on domestic any longer. And for that reason, a lot of these spiral budget, out of control, very flying glass no-brainers, CGI operas were being made because those were the ones that translated the most directly and the most easily. So it was clear that they thought they had a double windfall coming, a huge amount of money that would be coming in from streaming, which would be increasing on a continual basis, plus this largesse coming in from China. Plus there was an assumption and a reality of China pouring a lot of money into the studios. Now, we all know that once COVID hit, all bets were off in a lot of ways. But that didn't mean that this particular dream wasn't still taken very seriously. So you still had a lot of the money men and the Wall Street geniuses going around assuming that China was still going to be this big part. In the middle of that, Bob Iger went to China not only for Shanghai Disneyland, but to do Mulan. Now, here's where Westerners in general, and this is why I'm making this is the part that I haven't heard, screw up when they deal with China. In any Asian country, all you need to do to figure out what was likely to happen with China, and in fact, what's likely to happen with South Korea sooner rather than later, is that Asians will give a lot of money for a very limited time, and they'll even invest certain large amounts of money. But once they feel they've learned everything they want to learn, once they feel they've figured out a market entirely, unless they feel that it is indeed going to be profitable long term, they will shut it down. All we need to look is at the example of Japan. When Sony came over and bought Columbia Studios, people thought, oh my God, Sony's going to be every bit as much of a screw up as Coca-Cola was. How many people remember Coca-Cola owned Sony for a while? Anyway, everyone assumed that Sony would do that. But Sony was a very American company. Sony understood how American business worked. So they knew how to study it. And yes, you had Goober and Peters in there acting the fool, carting their private jets filled with flowers to go to one of John Peters' girlfriends. All this kind of nonsense. And meanwhile, Sony had a lot of spies in the lower level positions in the company who were pretending to be assistants, who were pretending to be mail people, who were pretending to be drivers and all of that. Meanwhile, they were talking to the rank and file employees and figuring out who the real brain trust was. And as soon as they figured it out, they were able to come in, get rid of Goober and Peters, and put in the new management. And as we know, Sony has been remarkably successful. Now you might ask, what happened with Matsushita? Why did Matsushita fail? Because Matsushita is an old school Zaibatsu. Zaibatsu is an enormous corporation that has ties to government. Let's face it, Japan's government is very fascistic in that way that you have this revolving door between government jobs and high corporate jobs, especially with these big Zaibatsus and the banks. And what ends up happening when you have an old school corporation like that, especially in a largely jingoistic and very conservative country like Japan, they are not going to be willing to look at the US and say, okay, we're going to be playing in their field, so we better learn how they do it. No, Matsushita came in and said, no, we're going to treat this as if it's a Japanese company and have this incredible hierarchical chain. And therefore, they set themselves up to completely implode. And when they imploded, so did most of Japanese investment in the United States. And that is likely what's going to happen with Korea, which, by the way, Korea was investing a lot of money in the US. They most recently fell for the scheme presented by William Morris Endeavor in order to get them to buy William Morris Endeavor Productions without realizing that that production company is worthless because of the MCA decrees of 62, they don't have any kind of a friendship deal with the actual talent. They're going to have to pay for them just like anyone else. They don't have any special hold over that. So sooner or later, Korea is going to come in and say, pull all the money that we have as investment funds. Now, China was the big one, and China was putting in a lot more money, even adjusted for inflation, than Japan ever did, or that Korea had been doing more recently. In fact, they had funded a lot of money in Paramount, and that particular deal had blown up badly. And one of the reasons Paramount remains in the dire state that they are in is because of that amount of money that had been spent rather foolishly over time, doing movies that they shouldn't have been making, with the assumption that they had unlimited resources that would be coming in forever. So Disney and Iger in particular are not paying attention to the tea leaves. And Iger in particular is a typical, there's no other way to say it, a California racist, where you speak a lot about gender equality, racial equality and all that, but really you still look at anyone who's not of your particular group as the help. And trust me, Iger looks at the Chinese as the help. He does indeed look at them as coolies who drop kids in the middle of rice fields, the way one of my bosses once said to one of our pregnant employees. Trust me, what goes on in Hollywood has not changed. This kind of talk still happens all the time. Anyway, so while Iger is thinking that the Chinese are stupid and that they can't quite follow the nuance that Americans are doing, and therefore it's going to be an open wallet for them to do whatever they want with extreme profligacy, he was led down the primrose path and lassoed by Z and China. And the trick on that was Mulan. Mulan was a test. And what was that test? That test was to see if Bob Iger was really a straight shooter or if he was another creepo. And he proved he was another creepo. How did he prove it? He proved it because he took the money from Mulan and made a typical American style movie, not one that had any indication of having any ability to play in mainland China, although they had the arrogance to think that it would. Let's be real. This is a Chinese story. Chinese literature, Chinese storytelling, Asian storytelling in general, is not Western three-part dramatic structure. And I gotta tell you, this drives me crazy in screenwriting class. Well, three-part dramatic structure is worldwide. No, it isn't. And it's extremely Abrahamic religion oriented if you want to get even more specific about it. Most Asian countries have an entirely different, much more pantheistic style of storytelling that ends more or less with either conformity or acceptance, not real joyful Western style happy endings or lessons learned. So you have Mulan, which is a traditional Chinese story, and you have it being written primarily by Caucasians. And I don't care how much research you do into another country, the chances are extraordinarily good, unless you've lived there a number of years and you actually interact with the average citizen, there's going to be endless amounts of nuance, especially in a culture that's 2 or 3 times older than Western culture. They're going to have all sorts of stuff that you're going to get wrong. Even something as basic as screen direction. When we look at Western style composition, it is always read by our eyes from left to right. In many instances, Asian compositions are read right to left. Let me show you this picture of Hokusai's The Great Wave. When we look at this image of the Great Wave, what do we notice? Well, on the one hand, with the Great Wave, it looks like there's this immense tidal wave that is destroying these guys in the boat. However, if we look at it from an Eastern perspective, remember, we're reading it from right to left. When we're looking at it from right to left, what we see is we see guys coming off of a wave who are kneeling in the boat, meaning that they are in acceptance. And the ones who are the closest to the wave itself are turning into it, almost like a surfer. What else is important in the picture? Japanese composition. In perspective, that which is lower in the image is closer. That which is higher in the image is farther. Therefore, what the image is showing, because Mount Fuji is at the bottom, and it's right at the bottom trough of the waves, it's saying, with the peace and tranquility of Fuji, you can come out of a problem and head into another one that might even be bigger. But with acceptance, with Zen attitude, you will most likely be able to either ride the wave or be in acceptance to that is your fate. Note that the crest of the wave is way up in the picture, so that is a disaster coming in the future. That is Asian aesthetics in a nutshell. And when we look at what was done with Mulan, trying to fit it around Western storytelling, doesn't matter you got rid of the dragon, it doesn't matter you got rid of the cockamamie stuff. Would have been better if they kept it in. What they did was they pillaged it. And China knew they would. So, what did that mean? What was Iger's win? Iger's win, where he could have gotten more money, would have been to go to his Chinese contacts, see himself perhaps, and propose. We shouldn't do just one version of this movie. We should do 2. We'll do one for the West. We'll do another one using a Chinese crew, using the Chinese aesthetic, using a Chinese screenplay. But we will show you some of the techniques that we have done. fair culture of exchange at that point. Now you have two movies. They would have probably gotten an additional $200 million. They would have had two different movies. And Iger would have won. He didn't. Instead, he made a movie that was insulting. So was it a surprise that once COVID hit, that in the Asian press, it was largely reported that Iger had been thrown out of the country? Not that, oh, well, this just didn't work, but that he had been pitched out. And remember that for a long time, China refused to distribute Disney property. They kind of made it across the board because they were too through. They saw what Hollywood was about, and they saw it was a bunch of scammers, and they weren't going to deal with it anymore. But that was the key. And think about how long it took for Shanghai to reopen. Shanghai Disneyland and Hong Kong Disneyland to open. They could have opened them sooner. Trust me. There was a little bit of a, we're squeezing you because we know these are big revenue sources for you. We're going to make you jump for your money. And here's another thing. Again, it was reported here a little bit, but it was reported a lot more elsewhere. Remember when COVID hit and Iger went around, and maybe it was Chapek at this time, but whoever was in charge was running around saying that one of the ways we will handle COVID is that we are planning to get some money from our investors to kind of cover things during this initially 2-week period. Who were those investors? I think we know who they were. I think we know who is now asking to be paid back. And I think through this, we can figure out why Disney is in such a panic right now and is trying to figure out what they can sell next. Because I got to tell you, Asians are nice until we're not. And once we've decided we're not, you owe us money, it's going to be on and pumping. This is a speculation on my part. I want to emphasize that. But I lived in Japan, still very connected with my former high school buddies from Japan. I myself am Japanese. My dad worked for government agencies in the United States, but worked very closely with the Japanese government. I got a little bit more credential here than a lot of others who are trying to figure this out and thus far have missed it all.
So no,